All righty, we are recording now. So thanks, Doug, for tapping in, folks. This is Gary Kyle. I'm here outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Not my home, but it is for now. Doug Kirkpatrick is kindly joining me on the West Coast. He's outside of Sacramento, down in the Doug. You said Modesto,
right near Modesto. Yeah.
Right near Modesto. So thanks for tapping in. I want to give you just a quick and brief introduction about myself, and then I'm going to have Doug elaborate on his background and his passion. For those of you who obviously are attracted to the title, this Blab session is about self-management and critical competencies for personal and business success. My involvement here is more as a moderator and an extremely interested person, somebody who is a little bit self-studied around self-management, in that I have done leader development programs for about 25 years. Much of it is based around self-management principles and practices. And so I come to it with that. I'm actually representing the Growth Leaders Network. That's growthleadersnetwork.org if you would like to know a little bit more about us. But we're just basically a global community of leaders, really, who are dedicated to growing ourselves, growing others, and creating growth cultures in organizations and the world, because we believe we need it. It's desperately needed, and if we don't do that now, the future is kind of in jeopardy. So if you'd like to check us out, it's just growthleadersnetwork.org. I'm a co-founder and happy to be involved with that. And in my work with the Growth Leaders Network, I ran across a book which I will unabashedly give a plug for Frederick Laloux, called Reinventing Organizations. Frederick's book highlights many organizations who he calls teal organizations, who have taken basically the constraints of business of the past and scrapped a lot of the things that didn't work and started weaving in a lot of new, well, some people would consider them new, some people would consider them very old philosophies, into creating environments where people thrive instead of do their time when it comes to work. One of those organizations was Morningstar and their Self-Management Institute. So I ran across Doug's name and work through that reading and some of the other work that I've been doing. So I'm very happy to be here today with Doug to talk about his work, his experiences, and a blog that was, oddly enough, Doug, written on my birthday, April 17th in 2014. So thank you. What a great birthday present I missed. Yeah, called The 5 Crucial Competencies of Self-Management. And so very happy to have folks on the line who are on, and for those folks watching the recording later on. So Doug, welcome to your very first Blab session. Happy to have you. And I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself, and we'll go ahead and just start getting on with the dialogue.
Great. Well, thanks. It's wonderful to be here. Good to be blabbing this morning with you, Gary, and everyone present. So I don't really love talking about myself, but I got out of college a few years back, and I consider myself very fortunate to have met a young entrepreneur named Chris Roofer, and he was starting a new venture at that time, and I was very privileged to be able to join him and his team and help start a little company here in Northern California. And that company was a food processor. It was very successful financially, but it was somewhat frustrating in the sense that we kind of by default adopted a traditional hierarchical bureaucratic management structure. And so our founder was at the top of the typical pyramid as the managing partner. We had a layer of managers. I was the financial controller. We had a production manager, a quality control manager, a sales manager, etc. And then we had a layer of supervisors who kind of organized things in the factory, and in terms of production. And then below the supervisors, we had a layer of coordinators. And below them, we had everyone else that did the real work of the business. And so the challenge was that no matter where in that pyramid a problem or a conflict or an issue arose, it always went straight to the top of the pyramid because we had an open door policy. And so we got exactly zero value, probably got negative value out of this management structure. It's just very frustrating. And so Chris went off to start a new company in 1988, a new facility called Morningstar. And I joined him at the new company, seeing it as a new, exciting opportunity. I'm very glad I did. We were working out of a little farmhouse here in Northern California and trying to construct this new factory. It was going to be a state-of-the-art, technologically advanced facility. And so our team, probably in March of 1990, was about 24 people. I was the financial controller. And one day Chris came into the farmhouse and said, I'd like to call a meeting and talk about how to organize the governance of this enterprise. And so we said, sure. Yeah. So we all got together in a little construction trailer out on the job site in the evening. And he passed around a document called the Morningstar Colleague Principles. And he proposed that we organize ourselves around some core principles. And really, they boiled down to two. The first principle is that human beings should not use force or coercion against other human beings. And when you think about that, it's really the foundation of all law everywhere in the world. So every law against theft and burglary and assault and battery and kidnapping and murder and all the rest is predicated on the foundation that people should not use force against other people. So essentially, it's an inarguable principle, one of the core principles of human life. And the second principle is people should honor the commitments they make to each other. And again, that principle is very foundational to law, especially civil law, especially contract law. Contract law would be meaningless if it weren't about parties honoring their commitments to each other. So we thought about this, we discussed it and kicked it around for a couple hours. And at the end of the evening, we just kind of looked at each other and said, oh, okay, we don't see any real downside. They make sense. And we're all busy, working 80, 100-hour weeks trying to get this factory built. And so it really didn't see any downside to it, didn't see that it was going to change our lives in any significant way necessarily. So we adopted self-management. And that moment was really the birth of organizational self-management at the scale of a large manufacturing enterprise. And so we had lots of work to do. This was March of 1990, so we had thousands of acres of tomatoes coming up out of the ground. We had hundreds of contractors on the job site. They were working, 24/7, fabricating, constructing, welding, etc. We had equipment arriving on ocean freighters from Italy, and we had to hire hundreds of people. So we kind of put it all together in a very short period of time, and in mid-July of 1990, we fired the factory up, and we produced 90 million pounds of tomato paste for the world market, and we changed the cost structure of the whole industry virtually overnight. And so very successful. Then we went on to grow and expanded operations. We built 2 more factories and expanded operations up and down the supply chain. And now Morningstar is the largest tomato processor in the world. I'd venture that everyone in North America has eaten the product because it goes into everything you can think of almost in the grocery stores. And exports around the world and sales in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And we never wavered from the core principles. We've never changed. They are still the principles in operation today. So this attracted attention. And Gary Hamel came out and wrote about us in the Harvard Business Review, 2008. My colleague Paul Green Jr. and I and Chris Rufer started the Morningstar Self-Management Institute to kind of promote the principles and practices of organizational self-management. And so we ended up meeting Frederick Laloux in the book you mentioned earlier, Gary. He came out and spent a day with us, or 2 days, and described us in his book as one of the teal organizations that has effectively, figured out how to self-organize and self-manage. So in a nutshell, it's kind of the story of my last quarter century anyway.
That's beautiful. So Doug, there's so much that you mentioned already that I want to dive into, but one of the things that came up immediately to me, and I think is so critical, really for everyone on a personal level as well as a professional level, has to do with that honoring the commitments made to others. Because no force or coercion. Okay, that's something. One of the things that I've read and my group's discussion is the difference between keeping your word and honoring your word. And so you said honoring your word. Maybe the folks who are on the line or might be watching the recording later on might really not know the difference between those two. Can you elaborate from your standpoint the difference between keeping, you say you're going to do something, sometimes you can't, and then honoring that word, which is really different?
Well, maybe that's a hard question for me, Gary. I hadn't really thought about the distinction there particularly, but I will say this: I've come to learn that commitments have a structure, and if you look at the work of people like Fernando Flores, a commitment is a speech act, and it's a request made by an initiator to a responder who has the opportunity and the freedom to respond to the request in whatever way makes sense to that person. Commitments also have a life cycle. So there's an opening, which it begins with a request, which is a speech act, which is more effective when it's made with clarity and transparency. And then there's a negotiation phase. So a person may simply accept the request and form a commitment, or may negotiate some third option that neither party had thought of earlier, or may respectfully decline to accept the request. So there's a negotiation phase, and then depending on the outcome of the negotiation phase, there's a performance phase, which the person who responds undertakes to fulfill the initiator's request, and then there's a close. So it's a closed loop system. It's based on speech acts. It has structure. It has a life cycle. And the problem in many organizations, if not most, is that commitments are often sloppily made. So the request is fuzzy or ambiguous. The response is glancing or unclear. The negotiation is mushy and ambiguous. And so people end up with unfulfilled expectations. And it's based on just a lack of understanding, a lack of clarity about what a commitment truly is. So in terms of honoring versus keeping, I don't know if I have much to say about that. But in terms of the importance of clarity and understanding the true nature and structure of a commitment, that's absolutely crucial.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and sorry about that. The question, because you and I haven't really talked about this before, is that honor word was just one that is in my circles. That when you try to keep your word, you say you're going to attend a meeting and take minutes. Something very simple. To keep your word, you would actually have to show up at that meeting and take minutes, and do exactly what you said. Well, sometimes things don't work out quite the way, and say you couldn't make the meeting. Well, you could still honor your word by contacting somebody else and saying, I can't make this meeting. Would you please go in my place, take minutes, and report out? So that's honoring the word, even though you can't keep the word. And I love how you described that it's definitely a closed loop with lots of different parts, but all of those parts require good communication and an understanding that if we're not consciously into the conversation, if we're not there really listening to what somebody else is saying, we're going to assume that we understood what they meant when we probably didn't. If we're not clear on what we want, they're not going to they're not going to know. So there's all kinds of tripping, trip up places right there while you're doing that. And one of the things in your blog that I mentioned that really hit me really strongly had to do with that consciousness, that really being present for that other person. And what you were describing was really a lot of energy in a way to be there for somebody else. But in a way, it's not any more energy. It's probably less energy than getting off on a bad start and then trying to figure things out as they go along.
Yes, absolutely.
Beautiful.
And by the way, on the keeping versus honoring, so I agree with you 100%. And so the honoring to me would be in the life cycle of a commitment. It would fall into the renegotiation phase. So you negotiate, and then you decide, you realize, I can't fulfill this commitment. You have to renegotiate it. And that's really what you're getting at with the word honoring, I think.
Beautiful. Now, Doug, I'm very curious, when you started describing Morningstar and the growth curve that you went through. I mean, that was a tremendous growth curve. While you were hiring up all of the new people, what was your process to help them understand the self-management principle? Because a lot of the people probably coming into this were very similar to what you just described, the previous company. You have this hierarchical, near's the top, it makes the decisions, and you down below, shut up and do your work, basically. How did you educate people when they were coming in?
So we did it a little bit ad hoc in the beginning. We would delve into it fairly deeply in the interview process. So having been involved in technical recruiting for a number of years, I came to appreciate that the people who were doing the hiring in a self-managed organization at Morningstar, the people who would actually be working side by side with new candidates are the ones that made the hiring decision. So mechanics would hire mechanics, electricians would hire electricians, and in the course of interviewing, they would cut to the chase very quickly in terms of technical competency and expertise. The bulk of the interview time was spent on self-management competencies and whether the candidate would be a good fit in this ecosystem. So that was actually of paramount importance. And so that's really how that information got conveyed in the beginning. Later on, with the birth of the Self-Management Institute, we got very much more intentional about it, and not only provided lots of detail about self-management in the interview and recruitment process, but also delivered a full day of self-management orientation to new colleagues, starting in 2008. And we go even further now and try to spend an hour of individual orientation before a person even goes through a full day of self-management orientation. And then, of course, once a person's on board, it's kind of a continuous process of coaching and mentoring by one's peers. So it's kind of a never-ending continuous process that takes place.
Beautiful. So I'm curious, when you started this off, obviously the experience base of self-management was, in its birthing phase, so you didn't have as much experience. And now 25, 26 years, whatever this is later, you've had a lot of learning. Do you feel that it's either equally important or more important to have that self-management skill set, if you will, versus the pure technical skill sets? Or, are these the types of things that there can be this range of mixtures that bring an extra texture, if you will, to the overall organization? Because you don't necessarily want, like you, I think, alluded to, all technically competent people, without really the self-management. And if you had all just self-management people without those technical skills, it might be a little bit different. Is there a blend? And when you put teams together, do you actually look at that mixture to say, okay, we want that tolerance, we want that ambiguity, because it adds to the richness, and the self-management skills will be learned if they're not quite there. And the technical capabilities, well, those will be learned as well.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. In forming groups or teams, depending on what problems or issues arise, people self-organize. So people, just get together on their own and work out their own teams. So there's no formal team concoction process that we go through. I mean, people just rush like white blood cells to a wound to deal with whatever issue it happens to be. And so we do have a mix of people with varying levels of self-management enthusiasm and competency, and different levels of technical proficiency. But of course, you need a certain level of technical proficiency overall to function in a technical environment. And the self-management competencies, people, it seems like people are either developing them and moving forward, or they've figured out how to self-organize in a way that they can maintain their status quo. And if people truly don't like it, once they come on board, they tend to self-select out over in a short period of time. So you do need a certain level of overall self-management awareness and competency, and you absolutely need a certain level of fundamental technical competency. You need both, and they have to be in balance.
Right. So back in the early 1990s, I would suspect the term self-management was not being used in that form. Maybe there was a different term being used, but probably that was not something that was on people's radar screens. It seems now, with Frederick's book and with a few of the other books that have been out for a while now, it at least is being raised to a higher awareness. What has been the major shift that you've seen that, say, schools? I'm just thinking about your employees, Morningstar's employees. They have a tremendous amount of seasonal workers, and some of the more technical and administrative, type of work. So there's a different base for education. Are people coming to this though with a higher awareness? And if so, is that because the schooling maybe has changed, or the dialogue has changed, or just people are coming to this overall realization that I count, I do count, and what my passions are count, and I will work better if I'm allowed to have this autonomy, like Daniel Pink says, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. If I have those, I'm going to thrive.
Right.
Just curious, so how things have changed a quarter of a century?
Right. No, it's a great question. I can't say that I see a lot of people coming to the organization with kind of an awareness or a heightened awareness of new ways of organizing. Seasonal people that come on board, they are super engaged and really happy with the environment because it respects them as individual human beings. We've had years where we've had 100% return rates of seasonal employees from one year to the next, where they're off work for 8.5 months, which is phenomenal. So they just thrive in the system. When we hire new year-round technical people, today I don't really see people necessarily knowing about teal organizations or necessarily being attracted to the idea of self-management. Some people have an awareness that Morningstar is organized in a different way. But certainly 25 years ago, there was no concept of teal at all.
Right.
But there were some hints of self-management. So there was a company called AES co-founded by a guy named Dennis Bakke, and he wrote a book called Joy at Work. And they were essentially self-organized. They were really cutting edge at the time in the late 1980s. James O'Toole wrote about self-management in at least one of his books. So there were hints of the coming phenomenon back in the 80s and 90s. But we certainly didn't see people having awareness of that at the time. They learned about it when they joined Morningstar, and it seems to be somewhat the same today. But I expect that will change as time goes on, because there is more general awareness now of better ways of working. And so I expect we'll see more interest as we go on.
Beautiful. So I know you and I are more familiar with the term self-management, but maybe the folks who are either online or going to watch the recording later on haven't read Reinventing Organizations, or they're less familiar with that. So could you summarize the basic principles, at least a little more than you did in the introduction, about self-management, and how Morningstar and some of these other organizations are taking that traditional, it's a pyramidal structure of C-suite up at the top, all the power supposedly, and then this trickle down to the bowels, if you want to consider the brain, and then the guts of the organization. How these differ in these teal organizations or self-managed organizations and more of the traditional ones.
Right. Well, in the case of Morningstar, it effectively caused the pyramid to completely implode. It did away with the pyramid. So the characteristics of organizational self-management as practiced at Morningstar are that everyone in the organization has an equal voice with respect to matters that affect them. And this is, really unusual. It's about respecting the voice of each and every individual. And so when you apply the first principle of not using force, that means you have zero command authority. That means no one, including the founder, has any authority to direct the activities of any other person. So no one can walk up to another person and say, stop doing X and start doing Y, or vice versa. No one has any authority to unilaterally fire anyone. And no one has any authority to issue discipline, because there is effectively no such thing as employee discipline in this ecosystem. So that's kind of a big deal. I mean, you either have command authority or you don't. It's binary. If you have command authority, that means you have effective control over other people's lives. And, you can change their lives and their circumstances for better or worse on a whim. And we abolished that. And so leadership is exercised through request. We discussed commitments a minute ago. Request, response, negotiation, persuasion, trust, communication, coordination, collaboration. That's how leadership is expressed. And so when you have no command authority, it forces you to be a good leader or not, because you have no ability to direct anyone else. You have to accomplish things through coordination. Actually, I would go further than that. I would say that command authority in traditional organizations causes leadership muscles to atrophy. I think that it makes for weaker leaders, because when you can just tell people what to do, you're relieved from the burden and obligation of engendering trust and respect and thoughtful communication, which takes time. So at Morningstar, we have to invest that time, because no one has any authority over others. And it creates better leaders, better leadership. Sometimes conversations and decisions may take longer, but we get better decisions because everyone is included and involved and engaged. And so the benefits are palpable.
Beautiful. And I know that Frederick talks in his book about how when somebody's given that power, that empowerment within them to decide what is best for them and for their job, it gives them that ownership and that sense of accomplishment because they get to decide. They also have the responsibility to make sure that, number one, what they're suggesting works. But the other thing that he talks about that I think I heard in your conversation was when you decide to do something that impacts other people, it's up to you to make sure that you dialogue with them so that they know, or at least you get input into, I'm considering buying $1 million piece of equipment. That's going to impact the overall budget of an organization. My job is to then go out to those people and say, this is what I'm thinking. This is why. How's it going to impact you? You get that feedback. But in the end, it's still my decision to purchase or to not purchase. But at least there's that dialogue. There's that collaboration and communication that is part of the process. And to me, that's extremely different from this top-down approach. We've decided that we don't have enough money in this budget, so it disempowers the person who's making a request for a piece of equipment. And then it's also disempowering, or at least the people at the top can then abdicate their power by saying, oh, it's the budget. The budget wasn't there, not me deciding, that it can't happen. So it's disempowering really for everyone all the way around. The one other thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I'm just conscious we're about at a half an hour, and I'd like to open up, because we do have a couple other folks online. Jen is here. She's a returnee and a very very beautiful person. Jen, if you wanted to hop into a seat and ask some questions, I'd love to have you there. And then Alfredo, our buddy from this morning, is back. If Alfredo, you would like to, I think it was Alfredo, wasn't it, who tapped in this morning? Would like to open up a little bit for a discussion. But Doug, I wanted to ask you about the tolerance for ambiguity, because that was one of the 5 competencies that you talked about. And life is messy just internally. Our personal lives are messy. Once you start talking about relationships between one person and another person, then it gets messy. And then once you start adding, the networks as it goes out.
Right.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the colleague letter of understanding? Because I looked at that. I actually have read it, and it's one of those things that is a beautifully written Magna Carta, or whatever it is. It's just beautiful document for those who don't know this that describes how people should play. And really, I think that's a beautiful part of this is you have to have joy. You have to really have fun while you're doing this. And it's because of this understanding that you can have fun and you can get work done. Take the work seriously. Don't ever take yourself seriously. So could you comment on that letter of understanding?
Yeah. It's interesting. We started in 1990. We actually ran for 6 years before developing that instrument. And the catalyst for developing it is we added another factory and just kind of grew to the size where we needed to have some scaffolding in place that would facilitate communication. And really what it is a document that describes one's purpose. So we start with a purpose statement, and we ask every colleague to define what we call a personal commercial mission. And in the course of that definition, we ask people to think about what it is they do and why are they working here? What is your purpose in coming to work here every day? And secondly, what does excellence look like in your role? I mean, what does it mean to perform this particular purpose at a high level? And lastly, how does what you do support the overall mission of the enterprise? So we ask people to think that through, work it through, come up with something that resonates with them in their hearts and heads, and that also makes sense for their fellow colleagues, the people with whom they'll be working side by side. So, if it takes you a month to figure that out, it's fine. Just take your time, get it right, and make sure that it works. Then we ask people to identify the exact process stewardships, process accountabilities for which an individual will be voluntarily agrees to be fully accountable, and list those out. And in the process of doing that, think about what is the scope of your decision-making authority. Are you making the decisions about this process? Are you merely making recommendations, or are you implementing the decision of someone else? Exactly what is the scope? And this gets down to what we talked about earlier about commitments. It's about clarity and transparency, is that people are yes, they're operating in an ambiguous ecosystem, but we're trying to provide some understanding and clarity at the same time, so that people don't go off and do things that nobody expects them to do or even wants them to do. And then think about how to measure what it is you're doing. We call these measurements or KPIs stepping stones, because we consider them stepping stones to perfection. So Morningstar doesn't benchmark against other companies necessarily, or other industries. Benchmarks against perfection. So in the case of an efficiency metric, perfection's 100%. In the case of a cost metric, perfection's 0. So we try to express these stepping stones in terms of time series, two-dimensional charts with trend lines. So if your trend line is bending up toward perfection, we publish these transparently so people can ask questions of each other, and we hope those questions would be, what can we help you do to bend that curve even steeper? And if the curve is trending downward, what can we do to help you turn the curve around? So we look at it as a collaboration mechanism, a way to trigger conversations in the workplace. And so people negotiate these colleague letters of understanding. The crucial letter in that acronym of CLOU is the U for understanding. So it's important to really be clear on what it is you're doing and why, and what it should look like, and to understand that as well for the people you work with most closely. And so it's a really important instrument for coordination and collaboration. And these are dynamic instruments. They're not static. They can be negotiated and renegotiated voluntarily at any time, depending on one's interest and inclinations and desired future state, or whatever it happens to be. So it really is just an enabler of a self-managed ecosystem where people can voluntarily interact and transact with each other on an ongoing basis.
So one of the things that that I heard in there that is not something that I've seen a lot of people do is understanding themselves first in order to develop that letter of understanding. Because a letter of understanding between the two of us is one thing, but I need to understand myself first, so that I bring myself into this saying, you know what, here are my strengths, here are my values, here are my needs, and here are my interests. So I know these as a package. Then I can more easily say, this is what I bring to the organization. This is why I want to work, how I want to work. So it seems like it's a pretty, that's a really introspective first step before you actually get to that. How do people in Morningstar get to that first step? Because I don't think that's commonly taught, or at least not in my world. So how do you actually encourage that, so that that letter of understanding really represents the person first, and then an understanding to the other person? Because without knowing your own values, your own needs, you're probably acting from an image of what you should be looking like, or needing, versus who you really are.
Right. Yeah. So the individuals that join the environment get a pretty big dose of self-management understanding as they go through the interview process. And when someone actually comes on board and joins, They have a colleague letter of understanding form on a desktop computer, and there are people who are very proficient with facilitating the population of the fields in that form, and just ask people to work it through. Just work through it and continue to populate it until you're good, until your colleagues are good with what you've put in there. And during that process, have continuous conversations and refinements and seeking of clarity until you get it right. And so we have actual facilitators who can help people and sit down with them and work through these things and do that all the time. So it's we just kind of set people up and point them in the right direction and let them kind of self-organize autonomously and until they get it done.
Beautiful. And to know that it's an iterative process going back, that establish a document, that's a great starting point. Things didn't change over the course of 3 months. We are dramatically changed, and you have that dialogue. So, wow, that's beautiful. So Doug, I feel we're just scratching the surface. At least I know from my answers, we're just scratching the surface. We're at about a quarter till. So I've asked some of the other folks on who are live if they'd like to join in. I'll do that again to say, please, this 2 seats are open up if you want to and are dressed and showered and not in your pajamas. We would love to tap you in by video. If you keep your camera off and then tap in, we could also hear you if you want to do that. And if not, I would just like to ask Doug a couple more questions, just because this is really fascinating to me. Because I've dealt with associations and businesses who fall more toward either side of the spectrum. So not necessarily fully self-managed, but are naturally operating along those lines. And then the ones who are more the traditional ones, if you want to call them that. The one thing that Frederick talks about in his book is that organizations, even large organizations, can transition from that typical hierarchical, very top-down approach to more of a self-managed organization. That's not an easy thing to do. There's a lot of unlearning that needs to happen on all levels before you can start transitioning. We tend, especially in times of trouble, to revert to our more animalistic minds, reptilian minds, which of course are our default settings, if you will, and that would be our past. What kind of recommendations would you have for an organization who is, or somebody within an organization saying, I'm an HR person, or I'm not, I'm just a factory worker, and they will throw in that just. Everyone has a chance to influence the whole process. What would your recommendation be to help them transition from disempowering hierarchical to more, if not a straight outright self-managed organization? And by the way, this is a lot of very valuable consulting information right here for the people who are on the Blab without the cost.
That's a big question, Gary. Before I forget, let me just say something real quick about empowerment, because you mentioned empowerment a little earlier. I like to talk about self-management as being beyond empowerment. Empowerment, generally speaking, is when one person with power lends his or her power to another person who has less power. And the problem with that scenario is that when you loan something, it can be repossessed. So we call self-management being beyond empowerment, because in self-management, everyone has all the power they need from the first day of work to build relationships, to acquire resources, to do their best work. Self-management is power itself. So that's one of the reasons we eschew the term empowerment when we talk about self-management. In terms of your question about transitioning, I have a dear friend, Peter Kessenbaum, wrote a number of articles and books, and he wrote an article in Fast Company I think 1990. I think maybe it was March of 1990. It's called "Do You Have the Will to Lead?" And he talks about the essential work of every human being is to embrace anxiety. And so for an organization, a traditional hierarchical bureaucratic organization, to transition to a self-managed environment requires leadership and requires intent on the part of a leader. And so if you're a middle manager or an HR manager and you've caught a vision for a better way of working, there's a number of things you can do, but unless the people who have the ability to promote or to squash a self-management initiative are on board, you're probably not going to have a true pathway to self-management. So I view the intent of the leader as crucial for supporting and nurturing these initiatives. Now, having said that, I would say that a number of things that we've done in terms of promoting and practicing self-management in Morningstar and other companies can be done effectively in traditionally managed organizations. It's just that those organizations will not reap as many benefits as they would if they were truly self-managed. In other words, abandoning hierarchy and command authority and relying on commitment. So there's nothing to stop any organization from developing personal commercial mission statements for each and every person associated with the environment. There's nothing to stop an organization from developing peer agreements that identify process stewardships and decision rights and performance measures for each process. There's nothing to stop that. Any organization can do that, and it would probably benefit from doing that. They're just not going to reap as many benefits as they would if they truly embraced complete and total organizational self-management. Also, I will say that even if you have a CEO who is opposed or doesn't see the benefits of embarking on a self-management journey, if you're a middle manager or an HR director or somebody that catches the vision, there are a number of organizational hacks that you can implement that will move you in the right direction, certainly. So there are a number of technologies, social technologies. Management is just a social technology, by the way, because all management is planning, organizing, controlling, selecting, and coordinating. So there are other social technologies that are very liberating. You can think of open space technology, world cafes. It's just a whole number of things that a person can play with and implement and practice that can open up, kind of crack open the cultural DNA. But unless you have a leader who's caught the vision and expressed the intent to go forward, it's going to be hard to embrace the full quantum of freedom and accountability that comes with true organizational self-management.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. So I think I hope that gives people hope. I really do, because we can all do our part. Like you said, it doesn't really matter where you're at in an organization. It doesn't really matter what your station is. You can bring something forward. You can bring it from a personal standpoint, an unofficial standpoint, if you will, or start these grassroots movements, whatever you want to call them. The full organization is not going to reap the benefit, of course. But one of the things that I have caught from you and really from some of the other reading that I've done is just that knowledge, just knowing that you're doing what you can do based on the resources you're given is really transformative for most people. So instead of, using Fred Kaufman's terminology, instead of espousing the victim mentality, where all of the power base is out there and I've got nothing, we embrace the player mentality where we say, you know what, I can't control all of that, but I can control this. And, to me, it's something that will naturally spread. There's going to be early adopters. There's going to be people who it rings true to, and, they start joining in with you. And then eventually there'll be this tipping point, or, or not. It just simply depends. But thank you for mentioning some of the hacks. Clearly, we don't have enough time to go into a lot of the other details that I would love to go into. We're now just about 50-something minutes in. So Doug, I think if it'd be okay, I'd like to wind this down and just simply say that I have learned a tremendous amount from you. I feel that this hour has been tremendously beneficial for me. I know we've had, quite a few people tap in, even though we haven't had a lot of questions from the outside. I'm sure there's going to be questions if there's not some right now. How could folks contact you if they wanted to follow up? What would be the best means?
Best means, I'd say I'll just throw out Twitter, Redshifter3 on Twitter. It's a great way to reach out. So it's easier than memorizing an email address or a phone number.
Perfect. Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Doug, thank you so much for all of this. I have been administering in the background, so you'll notice that there'll be a number of tweets. Some of the insights that you provided us, I've shared with the world. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate. I think what you've been talking about this entire hour is what Barry Schwartz calls practical wisdom. I don't know if you've enjoyed his book with the same title, but it's one of those things that that is encouraging to me, because there's the theoretical, great things that are out there, and then there's the reality of the work that needs to happen to get it done. And I certainly wouldn't ever want to propagate the idea that this is easy, because it does require energy.
Yes.
And so congratulations on your resiliency, for your insights, and for really all of the great things that you've done, and the beautiful information that you've shared by lots of different means. And I just simply say, for those who are listening live or later on, that there's a tremendous amount of information that is available on the Self-Management Institute website. And I think that's self-managementinstitute.com?
Org.
Or is it .org? Okay, .org. Self-managementinstitute.org. Beautiful place for additional information. I would just simply offer up again, if folks want more information who are listening to this recording, obviously they can contact Doug at Redshifter at Redshifter3. I am also available on Twitter. You've got my information if you're watching this recording. And just draw this to a conclusion and say, Doug, thank you so much for the hour. What a great way to spend my lunchtime. And hopefully this was an enjoyable way to start your day. And say, thanks, and I can't wait. And if you're open to more of these types of things, I'd love to dive into specifics, grab more people to do a more interactive dialogue, because I think there's some amazing information here that is desperately needed for folks to take to heart.
Great. My pleasure, Garrett.
So
thanks for having me. Enjoyed it very much.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, stop the recording, and we'll just simply bid everyone a beautiful day. So thanks again, Doug.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye now.